We will also be sending out the recording for today's session, but also there's a part 2 of this tomorrow morning, same time. And so I will be waiting and sending out the recordings of both of the sessions and all the resources as well after tomorrow's session. So you can expect to receive these tomorrow afternoon. And so with that, I would like to hand it over to my colleague, Tessa Barron. She is our SPP's Prepare Program Associate, and she'll be leading the presentations today. So thanks, Tessa.
Great. Thanks so much, Angela. And good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today and spending your time with us this morning to talk about different things that we can do to get ourselves and our clients and our communities prepared for disaster events. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like these more frequent and intense storm events are going anywhere. And so it really is up to us to do what we can to get folks prepared. So thanks again for joining. And we're just going to go ahead and dive right in. So I'll just give a very, very brief overview, since I know that the folks on the call today are our Share Programs partners, and so you've worked with SVP in the past. But as you'll see, we have a breakdown of the 5 main programs or 5 main interventions that comprise SVP. And what I want to point out here is that, with SCP's main mission being to shrink the time between disaster and recovery, well, the best way that we can do that is to reduce the need for recovery in the first place. And so our Prepare program, well, that's where we plug in. If we teach folks best practice and things that they can do to get more prepared, to safeguard themselves, their families, their properties, their communities, then we can do exactly that, shrink the time between disaster and recovery. And so, again, that's where we plug in into Prepare, into SVP's main organization, and that's where we'll be doing a deep dive today. So I have an agenda for what I'm going to review with us this morning, and I'm going to start with a Prepare program overview, but I am going to keep it pretty snappy so we can dive into the bulk of the presentation content. We'll start with building a culture of preparedness that does a really great job of grounding this conversation and just some high-level considerations that we want to keep in the back of our mind as we're getting into the nitty-gritty of specific actions that folks can take to best prepare themselves. We won't spend too much time there because I really want to get to, what are these key actions that folks can take to get prepared. And today we're going to talk about knowing your risks. And I'll share a specific tool that will enable folks to do just that. And then we'll spend the majority of the time talking about different things that your community, your clients, and your network can do to protect their homes. And so that will cover inspections and maintenance actions, those more routine actions we want folks to be thinking through and taking each year. And then quick actions, so what we can do in season to secure our home. And then lastly, mitigation options. Before I get into it, though, we do ask if anyone has a minute after we wrap up this presentation, and I'll be sharing this QR code again once we wrap up. But if you wouldn't mind taking a very brief 1-minute survey, it would really be so helpful for us in understanding what resonated well with our audience, and it'll help us understand what folks took away from the presentation. And I should say that we are going to be doing a gift card raffle for a $15 vanilla Visa gift card. So anyone that has a moment to take the the survey will get added to that raffle. And we hope that encourages folks to take that survey if you absolutely can. Okay, so getting into things. At our Prepare program, our main goal here is to equip not only households, but also local officials and businesses and nonprofits and really a community as a whole with the knowledge and tools needed to build capacity and to make informed disaster preparedness decisions. What we're trying to do is not only get folks more prepared, but if we're taking a step back and looking at the big picture here, what we want to do ultimately is build disaster resilient communities. So that way, when folks are presented with disaster events, they've anticipated those impacts, they're prepared for it, and ultimately they will be able to thrive after the fact. So that's our end goal, and preparedness certainly plugs into this larger picture of building resilient communities. But we'll get into that tomorrow if you have a chance to join us tomorrow morning. And I'll just share a couple resources that we have available at SBP before I dive into the presentation content. But I wanted to start here because, we're going to be sharing a lot of information, and I certainly don't want this to seem like information overload. And to avoid that, I want to make sure that you have, where to look after the fact to access this information. And so if you look on our website, we have a wide variety of preparedness information in the form of videos and checklists and guides. And we even have a suite of materials that are going to be posted in the near future that are updated. And so I highly encourage you to check that out after the fact if you're curious and interested in learning more. And so that's on the preparedness front, but we also have a plethora of information on our website about disaster recovery and different resources that are going to help folks navigate the recovery process. We did start out at SBP as a rebuilding organization, so in that recovery space. And so, since that's where our origin lies, we've got a lot of resources in that space. So I definitely encourage you to check that out as well. Okay, so now diving into things, and thanks for bearing with me there. But we're going to spend a little bit of time this morning talking about what does it mean when we say building a culture of preparedness. Unfortunately, we're in a period of time that's characterized, and I alluded to this before, but it's characterized by these disaster events that are more frequent and more intense, and they don't seem to be going anywhere. And so it really does need to be on us to get prepared and to do what we can as community leaders and community advocates to get folks that we serve best prepared. There are things that we can do now, knowing that this is a future. The future with more disaster events, there are things that we can do to get ourselves prepared and ultimately to keep ourselves and our communities safe. And that's what's most important here. So this is a really helpful depiction of the disaster spectrum. And we like to start with this graph because it shows us, and if you can see my mouse here, it shows us that typically when we think of preparedness, it is contained, whether it's a set of actions, activities, or even just how you're thinking about preparedness and when you're thinking about preparedness. It's contained to the beginning of the disaster spectrum. And when we talk about what do we mean by building a culture of preparedness, well, we want to really encourage folks to embed preparedness activities and conversations throughout the entire disaster spectrum. So we don't want it to be this contained thing in the beginning of the disaster cycle. And so that is putting it quite simply. But again, just this idea that we want to keep preparedness in the forefront of our minds. We will be engaging with it differently at different parts of the disaster cycle, but we don't want to just forget about it once we're in season or once we're looking at a blue skies period. We always want to be thinking about what can we do to get ourselves and our communities more prepared, no matter what time of year it is. And then the last thing here, and this is really important for us to talk about, preparedness is a layered approach, and it starts with the individual or the household level. And we'll be talking about things that you can do as community leaders that you can share with your clients so they can get prepared at the individual level. And again, this is where preparedness starts. But in order to really build a culture of preparedness, it does take the actions of key players at all these different layers that we have listed out. So community, and that's where we plug in as practitioners and as community leaders at the state level and at the federal level. So it's just important for us to wrap our heads around what this means by understanding all the different key players involved. Okay. So now we're going to get into some of the actions that can be taken at the household level to reduce risks and to get folks prepared. And that starts with knowing your risks. And it's really important that we start here because, well, simply put, how can folks get best prepared if they don't know what they need to prepare for? So we like to start with sharing this really great tool called Risk Factor. And Risk Factor was developed by the First Street Foundation. And this is something that we share in most every presentation that we do, because it's a very user-friendly tool that households can use they could plug in either their address or their zip code, but we do encourage folks to plug in their address so it shows their specific personalized risk. But we always share this tool out because it shares with folks, or it shows folks, a very comprehensive picture of what they might be dealing with in terms of their risk to specific disaster types and natural hazards. So how it works, again, folks will plug in either their zip code or their address, and they will get a ranking or a score from 1 to 10, and that will show their level of risk in terms of extreme heat, extreme wind, wildfire, and flooding. So again, a really great comprehensive look at what a family might be dealing with. And we like to share this out because this is how folks are going to make informed disaster preparedness decisions. They need to know what they need, what they might be up against. So again, definitely something that we encourage you to share with folks if they're curious about learning more about what they might be dealing with and wanting to get prepared adequately. Knowing in advance what risks are is quite important. And of course, we think that because we started with that with our presentation today, but it really is only half of the coin. We also want to ensure that the folks that we serve know just how important it is to get plugged into information sources in advance. And so when I say in advance, I mean downloading apps, whether it is the local news app or the weather app or other, local types of weather and emergency apps that folks might have available locally to them. We want to make sure that folks have these pre-downloaded on their phone, so that way in a disaster or when a disaster is coming, they can open the app and get plugged into these information sources, and they can get information in real time. We definitely want to make sure that folks know, for example, that they need to evacuate, so they can evacuate with enough time to get out of harm's way. So definitely, the other side of the coin here is getting plugged into information sources so folks can know what to do and when to act and how to stay safe. So those are the two items when it comes to knowing your risks. Now we're going to shift gears, and this is where we'll spend the majority of the presentation today, but to protecting the home and different things that folks, that we want to encourage folks to think about when it comes to safeguarding your property. And we break this down into 3 different buckets. And the first is inspections and maintenance. The next is securing for emergencies, which will be those quick actions you could take pre-event. And then property improvements is where we'll tie in those mitigation options. So with property inspections and maintenance, and we'll look at just a couple things here inside the home, outside of the home, and a roof in a second. The idea here is that we want to make sure that folks are going through an exercise yearly of inspecting these different things. And I have just a couple examples pulled here: the heating and cooling systems, checking, the state of the furnace filter. Does it need to be swapped out? Smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, fire extinguishers, and things like that. And these are not necessarily burdensome actions, but it does take some planning in advance. And so we really want to make sure that folks know that this is so important, because if you're going through a yearly inspections and maintenance exercise, and if you are you as in the client, if the client is identifying some fixes that need to happen, we want to make sure they find them early, 1, before they become very expensive, and 2, so there's enough time to actually make those fixes before we find ourselves in the thick of disaster season, because that would, of course, be very problematic. So, these again are somewhat simple actions, but it's just this idea of knowing that you need to do this so you can plan and make sure that you leave yourself enough time to do whatever might surface from this inspection, or whatever you might find might need a little bit of upkeep. So here are again some examples of what we're looking at inside of the home, but just as important is to take a look at the outside of the home and to go through that same type of walking around their property and seeing what needs to happen to make sure that your community's households are in best condition to face different types of storm events. So if we're talking about something with a high wind event, we definitely want to make sure that any type of items like dead trees or overhanging limbs or yard debris are cleared. So that way we can avoid them becoming dangerous projectiles if, again, we're dealing with a high wind event. So something certainly that folks can do, again, walk around and do a little bit of an inspection of their property to see what's there. Maybe there's even some outside furniture, things of that nature. That can be secured, brought inside, and again, anything that we can do to make sure that things don't become dangerous in high wind events. That's one thing. Another thing when it comes to, what can we do to protect the outside of our home and safeguard it from different types of storm events is let's take a look at things like our gutters and our drains and our downspouts. If those are filled up, if they're not cleaned out properly, well, then if we're dealing with a heavy rain event, they're not going to function properly. And we might see flooding that might otherwise, could have been avoided if the home was in good condition, if it was in good shape, and if these different systems were in place, that were able to, function how they were meant to. So all of these items in this inspections and maintenance category, again, are not difficult or not quite burdensome, but it's just a matter of planning in advance and understanding that when we're talking about getting prepared, it's more than just pulling together your disaster supplies kit. It's more than just understanding your emergency evacuation routes. It's taking a look at your house and making sure that it can function properly and do what it's meant to do to keep you safe. And then the last thing here is the roof, of course, is a very important piece of the puzzle. We want to make sure that whether a household member can do this or if they need to bring in a professional to come and inspect the roof, that this is a part of this regular inspections and maintenance exercise as well. Because of course, if your roof is not in good condition, that could lead to a wide array of other problems. And we want to make sure that folks are avoiding that to the best of their ability. We have on our website at SBP a really detailed checklist to help folks understand exactly what they should be looking for. It can seem like a lot. Roofs are, again, structurally speaking, one of the most, or if not the most important piece of a house. We want to make sure that we're giving folks the tools that they need to know exactly what they're looking for so that, this inspection activity or exercise can happen as it needs to. Now, I wanted to take a moment here and talk about fortified roofs. We at SBP in our build program, we use fortified roofs as often as we can because these roofs are scientifically proven to hold up and to stay on a household during high wind events, which is, again, of course, of utmost importance. We want to make sure that we're minimizing the amount of roofs that are lost during disaster events. And so these fortified roofs are one way that we do that. This is definitely something that I encourage you to check out. We'll talk more about this in a few slides here, but fortified roofs in some states do have can reduce the cost of insurance premiums. But again, we'll talk about that in a bit. But if you're talking to any community members, any clients, and they are expressing concerns about the fact that, maybe it was time for them to get a roof inspection, they brought in a professional and it was recommended that, listen, unfortunately, we do recommend that your roof gets swapped out. It's just that time. We always want to encourage folks to look at fortified for the benefits that they might have on keeping a home better safeguarded from high wind events. And also from hail events, from severe storm, water damage and things of that nature, but also because while they are could seem cost prohibitive at first blush, there is that other side of the equation of, what could this do to decrease your insurance premiums? That's something that we always want folks to be thinking about. When it comes to power outages, we see, power outages can happen with any type of storm event. And so it's absolutely critical that folks are taking these very simple steps to make sure that they are protected. So when we're talking about what can we do to prepare for a power outage, well, that's as simple as let's take a look at all of our fire alarms. Let's take a look at our carbon monoxide detectors, and let's make sure they're working properly. And then the other thing there in terms of how can we get best prepared for a power outage, for, again, any type of storm event in which this can happen. Well, that's thinking through what alternative backup energy source is available to a household and what makes the most sense for that specific household's energy needs. During a power outage, we want to make sure that folks understand that it's quite important to go around and unplug appliances, electronics, and if you're going to be using a backup power source like a generator, for example, that those generator safety rules are at the forefront of folks' minds. Generators and other backup power sources are very, very wonderful tools for households when they are dealing with power outages, especially if you have someone in your family or if you know folks in your community that are sensitive to colder weather. So very great tools, but it's absolutely critical that folks understand that there are certain safety precautions that must be taken in order for these tools to be most effective. And then also, we do just always include in here that we always want to make sure that folks are aware of the fact that if they are in need of a heat source, we need to, for our safety, absolutely avoid at all costs using a gas stove top or an oven to heat a home because it just really is quite dangerous. So if you recall, when we were talking about, what are the three different buckets? What are the three different categories of protecting our homes and safe, different things we can do to safeguard our homes from disaster events? What can we teach our community? The first bucket was inspections and maintenance. We just talked about that. Then the second bucket that we're going to take a look at today is quick actions that we can take to prepare a home pre-disaster. So if a storm is coming, we have our apps downloaded. We see the weather. We see that a storm is coming tomorrow, next week, whatever that might be. Now it's time to take a look at these quick actions to secure our property and keep it safe to the best of our ability. And so I have just a couple examples listed out. Laying sandbags, moving valuable items off of the ground floor, putting up storm shutters. And these are, again, quick and simple, easy actions that if we think through them in advance, we can absolutely take advantage of them pre-disaster. Now, this is a common theme, and I'm maybe will be a little bit repetitive here, but same as inspections and maintenance, how it's so important to do this in advance. We need to also be thinking through quick actions that we might want to take in advance as well. There is a certain planning component of this. For example, we'll look at laying sandbags. Well, pre-disaster, it's very easy to go in your garage or in your basement and grab your sandbags. But the step that precedes that is, I need to purchase my sandbag. So just thinking through those types of things and making sure that you're encouraging folks to understand, what tools and what resources they might need in advance is very important. Now, we include this slide here because we frequently hear that, well, let's take a step back. As community leaders, as practitioners, we want to do the best that we can to make disaster events, which are very stressful and very hectic events, we want to keep the peace. And bear with me for a second. We want to keep the peace to the best of our ability. We want storm events to be as predictable as possible. And in order for them to be predictable, folks need to have the tools in advance, the knowledge and the tools to keep themselves safe. So one way that we can do that we can keep the peace, that we can help folks make disaster events as predictable for themselves as possible is knowing alternatives to, what they might go for. Sandbags might be the first thing that folks go to the store to purchase when thinking through, okay, how can I keep my home safe pre-disaster from floodwaters? Well, let's consider a scenario where all of the local stores have run out of sandbags because a storm is coming and everyone went to the store all at once. Well, that certainly might cause a rise in panic, and we want to avoid that whenever possible, especially in a storm setting, because those are very hectic atmospheres to begin with. So one thing that we can do, and I'm just pulling out one example with the sandbags, but it's to offer alternatives right off the bat. And these alternatives are things that our community members might likely already have. So when it comes to sandbags, you don't necessarily need a sandbag. There are other things that can be used that will perform the same way in keeping those floodwaters away from a home. So that includes things like you can use a pillowcase or a plastic bag, but doubled as the bag itself. And then for the filling, it can be anything that is heavy, but moldable. So we could do something like kitty litter or dirt or potting soil or even old rags or clothing, anything along those lines that, again, can be molded, but it is heavy enough, like sand, so it still does the trick. So again, just one example, but these are the types of things that when you're having conversations with folks that might be alarmed, and might be in a somewhat of a state of panic if their go-to tool for keeping themselves safe is out of stock, this is something you can immediately offer to them. And many folks might already have, kitty litter or extra pillowcases and things of that nature. When walking through with your community, different types of actions that can be taken pre-event, some of them, might seem inaccessible, whether that's because there's just a lot of information that folks need to go through to understand, what the most appropriate tools are. And maybe they don't have time to go through an exercise of looking at all of the different considerations that need to go into, for example, what are the right storm shutters that are going to best serve my house's needs. So having a baseline of an understanding of the different considerations folks need to be thinking through could be a really helpful way for you to help your community navigate storms pre-disaster and navigate how to get prepared. So, for example, and I pulled out storm shutters as just another example. There are different items that we want to make sure that folks have the forefront of their minds when going through all the different types that are out there. There are many different types of storm shutters. And again, it can feel quite overwhelming. So if you're going to have conversations with folks, instead of just giving a list of what the different options are, walking through the very next step is only going to serve to as a great benefit for your community. So things like sharing maybe a list of the different types of storm shutters that are available. What are the different materials? What are your specific risks? Because that might dictate a specific type of storm shutter. It's not just a conversation of let's go to the store and purchase them. There's some backup planning that needs to go into it. And also with this idea of when we're talking about preparedness, a lot of it is centered around planning. This installation piece is key. If we want to be able to use storm shutters in an event, well, how much time do we need to plan into some background research? How much time is going to go into installation? Am I going to install it, or is a professional going to install it? And these are things that we don't want folks to run into, to not expect, and then to run into and feel a sense of pressure and feel rushed because a storm is coming. We want folks to have plenty of time before a storm to think through all of these very important items, so they can make sure that they're getting, what is most fitting and what is most appropriate, and then therefore going to be most effective for them. So now we'll spend some time talking about mitigation options and insurance. And we typically start this part of the conversation with the impact that mitigation options in many cases have on insurance. And that's because a lot of these might seem cost prohibitive and alarming and just out of reach for some households. So by starting off a conversation that might seem otherwise inaccessible to folks with some impacts that community members might benefit from, it's a really great idea. So, simply put, we like to talk about it as, if you're implementing mitigation options and those are going to reduce the risks of your property from a disaster event, that's going to reduce the cost of your insurance because your property, in many cases, because that property is better safeguarded, it's better protected, and it has a lower risk. And so those two parts of the equation really work together. We want to reduce our risks, not only because it'll keep ourselves safe, it'll keep our family safe, but also because again, the impact that that'll have on our insurance. Yeah, great thing that we want to make sure that folks understand. And so we start there, but then because some of these are more costly, we always want to offer the more budget-friendly mitigation options first. And in the same vein as the last bucket of those different actions to take to secure a property pre-storm, when we're now moving to our third bucket of mitigation options, it's a really great idea to list out some different examples, but then to take it to the next steps. And we'll do that together. But things like, here are our options, and here are the benefits of replacing carpets with tiles, or here are the first things that we want you to consider. Here are the steps, and just making it a little bit more accessible and a little bit less of an information overload, because a lot of folks just might not be aware of what some of these things are. So for example, and I'm going to walk through how we pose it at SBP, some of these specific examples in just a slide or two here. But again, replacing carpets with tiles and installing backwater preventers, sump pumps, and flood-proofing interiors of a home are these more budget-friendly mitigation options that we want to urge folks to consider. And it's crucial also that folks understand that when we're talking about mitigation options, well, these are really going to be the most effective ways to safeguard a property from flood waters. So we definitely don't want to just write these off because they might seem a little bit information dense and require a lot of research into it. We want to share with folks, this is how you're going to keep yourself safe, and let me lead you through the first steps in helping you navigate which is going to be the most appropriate for you. Okay, so for example, this is how we would pose it with replacing your carpets with tiles. An example of how you can do that is just going right into the benefits of that. Benefits are that replacing carpets with tiles are flood resistant. They're more durable. They're easy to clean. And they're also easy to install. And I can speak to that because I actually installed them myself, and much easier than I expected. And if I can do it, I'm very, very hopeful that folks in your community that you have these conversations with will be able to do this as well. I want to emphasize here something that folks might not be aware of, and that is that just 1 inch of flood water, just 1 inch, can result in at least $25,000 of damage. And that's just 1 inch that we're talking about. That is absolutely significant. So if we're talking about something that can be implemented, that's low maintenance and that's easy to clean, and that in many cases will dry out again, so we can avoid a potentially $25,000 in flood damage. We definitely want to make sure that folks are aware of this as an option, a mitigation option to implement in their households. So that's one way to pose it, is here are mitigation options, and let's look at some of the benefits, and that'll help point you towards what's going to be the most fitting for your household. Another way that you can take a look at it is taking some of these terms that community members might just not have total awareness on exactly what they are. And backwater valves, and I'll share another example in a second here. This is another one of those. Or this is one of those examples where there is some confusion on different terms that get that folks confuse between backflow pumps, backflow valves. There's a lot of different names that get thrown into the mix, and so it just leads to a lot of confusion. And so being a community leader, we can do our part in helping clear all of that up for folks and point folks towards what will be most helpful for them. So we're looking at backwater valves, and I emphasize that again because there are a lot of different names that folks accidentally bring up when they're talking about backwater valves, but that's what they're trying to say. And a backwater valve, picture it like a door. It's a very simple device that gets installed in a home's plumbing system that basically blocks the home's plumbing from the public, city, county, whatever that is. And it just functions like a door. So when the water is flowing as it should, it pushes up against the door and lets it go through. However, when we see water start to backflow, for whatever reason, maybe we're talking about a flood event. If the water is flowing in the wrong way, then it hits the door and it closes it so the water can't go through. So really the main purpose of a backwater valve is just to make sure that our water, that household's water sources do not get contaminated with any type of flooding event or backflow event from the public water source. So really it is a quite simple device, but it can just seem like information overload when folks are looking at these lists and maybe they see some terms that they aren't intimately familiar with, and that could again just seem quite overwhelming. So just taking a moment to talk about, hey, this term might be unfamiliar, this is what this is, and here's why it's useful. That's a really great way to make this information more accessible for folks. And again, here I did just explain here, but this just ensures that any type of backflow, sewage even, gets stopped, and it keeps the family's water source safe. And of course, that is of utmost importance. Same here. This is another example where folks might have some familiarity with, what sump pumps are, but we don't want to assume that everyone will know exactly what that is. And this is something that can get installed that can keep a family safe from the different types of impacts that like puddled water can have. And so again, just starting off on giving an explanation of what exactly a sump pump is and what the benefits of installing a sump pump are would just make this conversation more accessible to folks. So sump pumps are devices that get installed that, if you're dealing with any type of flooded event, it'll make sure that that water is transferred out of the household to somewhere where it can flow safely away. And then again, sharing definition and usefulness. That's just a helpful, 2 bits of information to share. Of course, we want to avoid standing water whenever we can. That's a health hazard. And, we could, unfortunately see things like mold and mildew grow and other types of, electrical hazards and things that we just want to be avoiding. So, yeah, a little bit of education there on what these different tools are can go a long way. So now lastly here, we'll talk about mitigation options. And these mitigation options, well, the past few slides are all mitigation options, but we shared some budget-friendly ones first because those are, a really great entry point into these conversations about mitigation options and different things that that folks can bring to their house to increase their safety and ensure that they are protected against future disaster against. But those were budget-friendly mitigation options. Now we're looking at mitigation options that might have, a little bit of a higher price tag associated with them. So we're talking about things like raising mechanicals and filling basements, elevating homes, and things like that. And especially for these that might be a little bit more pricey, taking some time to dive into specifics will really go a long way. So for example, filling in a basement, we might not need to do any type of defining because, filling in a basement, it speaks for itself. That is exactly what we're talking about here. But taking the time to go through maybe some considerations. Why would you need to do this? So maybe, encouraging folks to think through how often does your basement flood? And does your basement low below the local base flood elevation, which is going to help you understand how much a basement floods? And are there any things in a basement that are at risk if your basement does get flooded? And maybe have you dealt with a flood event before? And have any of these important mechanicals been flooded? Have you dealt with this? And so these are just important things that we want folks to think through and starting to, look through these different mitigation options and navigate what is the most appropriate for their specific situation. Elevating homes is another one. And this is something that we definitely encourage you to talk with folks about considerations. And then I'll share some first steps for how this process works, because, this is something that will surely keep a family safeguarded from disaster events. And I should have mentioned this before, but elevation certificates are the best way to get your insurance your insurance premium reduced. And they're not required in all cases now, but certainly something that we want folks to know. There is that benefit. So when you're looking at these more costly mitigation options, there are some discounts and incentives that are out there that are just important supplements to these conversations. So considerations: what is the house? Is an elevation possible for your house? What is your house structure? What is the age of the house? Where is your house located? So just easy, high-level bullet points of a starting point of getting folks to think through if this is a feasible option for them. And then sharing if folks get to the point where they understand, okay, this is something that maybe makes sense for me. I have this background knowledge, but what does this process actually look like? That's another helpful piece of information to share with folks to help them figure out if this really does make sense for their specific situations. In our build program, I did share a little bit about the fortified roof. We have a great picture over here. But again, we do try to implement sustainability and resilience measures in our rebuilds as often as possible. And that's because we want to avoid folks being in this situation again. We want them to leave our program in a better shape than when they came to us. So adding things like vinyl plank flooring, and we have some pictures of that over here, that are flood resistant, that are durable, are easy ways that we can ensure that folks leave our hands in a good shape. And fortified roofs, I won't spend too much time there again, but this is something that, again, will keep folks quite protected against high wind events, rain events, hail, and they're scientifically proven to do just that. And so we definitely bring those into the mix whenever possible. And one of the last things that we'll talk about here is that, unfortunately, in the disaster space, we see that post-disaster atmospheres are just playgrounds for contractor fraud. We see this all too often. And so ensuring that folks are prepared, this is a piece of that. So we want to make sure that people understand that this is something that happens, this idea of contractor fraud, and we want to give them the tools to help them avoid that. And we have some great information on our website that really dives into the specifics on how you can ensure that folks are avoiding contractor fraud. But things like, being very diligent in vetting the contractors that you're working with, getting copies of their licenses, of their IDs, of their workers' compensation, and not just going with the first contractor that you find, kind of going through a process of looking at different options that are out there. And then also when you get to the point of pulling together that contract, ensuring that it has these specific items that are listed out here to make sure that all of your needs are accounted for in that contract. But again, definitely encourage you to go on our website and to look at our contractor fraud portion, because we have a lot of really great information that gets into the specifics. So we'll go ahead and start to wrap up now. And this is just going to be the next few slides of different resources that I encourage you to either take a screenshot of, or I know these slides will be sent out after the fact. So if you just keep this in the back of your mind and circle back to it when you get the slides. But these are some resources that we have at SVP on our website at SVP. And I started to mention before, but we have, when it comes to preparedness, a wide variety of checklists and guides and 1- and 2-pagers and e-learnings and videos and many different formats that if you're talking to community members and they're wanting to get educated, this is certainly a place that you can point folks towards. And we also, again, have a lot of great recovery resources as well. When it comes to learning about fortified, I highly recommend that folks check out the program at IBHS. We work with the fortified roofs, but they have an entire construction standards. And so it's a lot of information to check out. And it would definitely point you in that direction if you're interested in learning more. And then lastly, FEMA has plenty of resources. If you search up these key items, that'll take you to some of the topics that we talked about today. And so I either encourage you to take a screenshot of this page now, or to check this out once you get sent the slide deck after the fact. There's a lot of great information out there. And we want to make sure that you're avoiding getting inundated with information. And so using some key items to guide your search is helpful in doing that. So lastly, these are the actions that we talked about. Working with your community members and your clients to help them understand their risks, maybe even looking at risk factor together, walking through the main items of an inspection, regular inspections and routine maintenance exercises, securing the home pre-disaster, and mitigating risks to property are all going to be really crucial actions to safeguard a family and to keep people protected and staying safe throughout these disaster events, and unfortunately don't seem to be going anywhere. And with that, here is the QR code. If you have a moment, once we wrap up in just a minute or two here, if you wouldn't mind taking the survey, we would greatly appreciate it. And we will be letting the winner of the gift card raffle know that they are the winner tomorrow, I believe at noon. So have a little bit of time to fill that out, but I encourage you to take that if you have a moment as soon as we wrap up today. Okay, and with that, we will wrap up. We do have a few minutes for any questions or any discussion that that anyone might like to talk about, but I will pass it over to Angela to wrap us up if not.
Thank you so much, Tessa. Appreciate it. And I've saw a few people come in and out. So for the group that's here, would love to hear from you. What of this are you doing? Have you done? Is new to you? Any feedback or comments or questions that you have, we'd love to hear from you. So I'll give it a minute for that since we do have a few more minutes. Yeah, let me see if we can hear from the group. Looks like we have a comment in the chat from Stephanie. Thank you, Stephanie. And Stephanie, you can also come off mute. Happy to hear from you. That you missed some of it, but you're still able to. Are we still able to refer people to us that are still having issues getting help from their insurance or that are uninsured? Do you mean refer people to our build teams, Stephanie?
Hi, sorry. So just to you in general, I'm not exactly sure what all like SBP is still offering. But I know that here in Charlotte County, we're still having a lot of people dealing with insurance claims and it's not being, approved or not getting enough help to repair homes, or that they're uninsured and just don't have the funds, to repair their homes. So they're kind of still stuck in that in between.
Yeah, so you're in Charlotte County, Florida, right?
Correct.
Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah, so I think we still have a few options available in Florida. I believe we still have our disaster assistance program, which will help with FEMA appeals, which I don't think is specifically what you're talking about, but that is one option. Our build team, which is located in Panama City but has a satellite office, I think, out of Tampa or Orlando. They are also, I think, still taking applicants. I don't know if they're helping with insurance or if it's with the intention of, obviously SBP rebuilding the homes. So there's that option. And then the third option is we do have some partner organizations in Charlotte and Sarasota counties that we've funded through our share program. So they received grant money from us to rebuild homes there. And I'm not sure which agency you're with, but I could also introduce you to them. And then our last option is our Recovery Acceleration Fund program. And I'm not sure which counties they're operating in, and I should know, but they're also, I believe, very interested in finding clients that might be eligible. All that to say, there's a bunch of different options, Stephanie. Maybe you and I can just connect separately and I can figure out which one is appropriate for an introduction.
Perfect. That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Good question. And what group are you with?
I'm actually with United Way.
Oh, okay. All right. Very good. Esther, any questions? Maria?
No, you did a great job on the presentation. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed seeing the disaster spectrum, kind of how it was laid out. That was very, it helps me. It's visual. I appreciate that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That I'm a visual person as well. So when I first came across that, it's really helpful in understanding that we do look at each part of the spectrum as separate parts. And so especially when we're talking about preparedness, understanding that we don't want it to be siloed to the beginning. Yeah, using a visual to really help understand that we're looking at it here, but we want to insert that throughout the entire spectrum. Really drives home the point. So yeah, glad that did that for you too.
All right. Well, if there's not any other questions, I think we can wrap it up. And like I mentioned, this session has been recorded. A PDF download of the slides will also be included, and also the survey that Tessa mentioned at the end there. We'll send all of that out to you folks tomorrow after the part 2 of this presentation, and that will be given by Helen Wiley, who's the director of our Prepare program, who's also on the call today. So that'll be the same time tomorrow. I don't know, Helen, if you wanted to add anything. Otherwise, we can wrap up.
No comments from my end, but we hope to see you guys back here tomorrow.
Awesome. Thank you all, and yeah, have a good rest of the afternoon.
Thanks, Angela. Bye.